deliberations. That was a couple months ago. And I remember the outcry about the United States Senate not following the regular order and passing a budget. And on that March morning, we did regular order. We passed the budget. We took up lots of amendments. We spent hours of debate. We voted on many, many amendments. And the Senate worked its will. And, of course, the House has also worked its will. It's passed a budget that is different than the Senate budget. And now the next step in regular order is for the House and Senate to meet in what's called a conference to work out the differences between the House and the Senate so that we can have a budget for the country. That's how the regular process works. And I know for the last couple years we've had budgets. We've had budgets because of grand bargains that have been agreed to on debt extensions and things like that. But there was an outcry to follow regular order. That's what we should do, follow regular order. So the next step is to go into a conference. And I must tell you, I quite don't understand why the Republican leader is objecting to going to conference. He's trying to say, we'll go to conference if we agree with the House. No, we don't go to conference because we agree with one body. Go to conference to work out your differences. So I'm extremely disappointed that those who are yelling the loudest about following regular order are now preventing us from using regular order. We need to get to conference, and one of the reasons we need to get to conference is that we can get rid of sequestration. Sequestration is across-the-board mindless cuts. It treats every priority in government the same. That's mindless. That's not what we should be doing. It's having a major impact on the mission of many agencies in this country. They can't do what the public wants them to do because they don't have budget support to do it. For an agency that's affected by sequestration, it amounts to almost 10% of their budget because they had to cram in the savings over a short number of months. It only affects some agencies, not all. Not all the programs are affected by sequestration. But those discretionary programs that are affected are across the board without any discretion. Now, Madam President, if you ran into a tough economic time or someone that we represent and they lose some income, they look at their family budget. They may have money put aside for rent or mortgage payment. May have some money put aside for the food budget for their family. Maybe there's some money put aside to go to an Oriole Red Sox game. And they're going to have to make some tough choices, but they're going to make choices based upon what is most important in their family. And they're certainly going to pay their rent payments or mortgage payments to keep the roof over their family home. So that's what we should be doing. We got to make decisions, and we can't do these across-the-board cuts. It is hurting agencies. These are cuts on top of cuts on top of cuts. And let me just mention one group that is being particularly affected by that, and that's our federal workforce. And these are the people who are at NIH, talented scientists doing the research that is keeping us healthy. They're finding the answers to the dread diseases in our society. These are people that are standing guard on our border. They're keeping us safe. These are people who do food inspections to make sure that we have a healthy food supply. These are people that help our seniors to make sure they get the checks they need for the dignity in their older years. These are people that are working for the public. Now, what have we done to them? 3 straight years of freezes, no increase in their salaries. We're now looking at what we're going to do with their benefit structure. On top of that, we have freezes on the number of employees. Therefore, they're being asked to do more with less. And now we have furloughs, which is basically cuts in their salary. And it's not the federal payroll that causes the deficits we have today. As you and I know, it's the fact that we went to war in 2 countries, we cut taxes, we went through a recession, and we've got to answer the way of getting out of this problem in a balanced approach. We've already done the discretionary cuts to those agencies, and we're now affecting their ability to do mission. I want to just mention some of the effects of sequestration on the citizens of Maryland, who I have the opportunity to represent in the United States Senate. Maryland will lose approximately $14 million in funding for primary and secondary education. 12,000 fewer students will be served, and approximately 30 fewer schools will receive funding. You know, in Maryland, we believe education is a top priority. That's how we compete. That's how we invest in our future. We invest in our children. Maryland will lose approximately $10 million in funds for about 120 teachers, aides, and staff who help our children with disabilities. 770 fewer low-income families in Maryland will receive aid to help them finance the cost of college. And around 440 fewer students will get work-study jobs that help them pay for college. These are programs that Democrats and Republicans have fought over the years to make sure they're funded. Now in Maryland, we're going to have to cut back. Head Start and early Head Start services would be eliminated for approximately 800 children in Maryland. And the list goes on and on and on. We would lose $3 million in environmental funding to ensure clean water and air quality. We've worked hard to clean up the Chesapeake Bay and to provide safe environment for our families. That's in jeopardy as a result of sequestration. Maryland, there will be tens of thousands of civilians in the Department of Defense that will be furloughed, reducing payroll in our state. And Maryland will lose $317,000 in justice assistance grants. This supports law enforcement. We all talk about supporting law enforcement. And I have a full list, and I'll put most of this in the record. My point is that these are cuts that I don't think the public wants us to do. And Congress, each of us say, oh, we didn't mean that. We didn't mean that. Well, it's time for us to act. Democrats and Republicans coming together in a bipartisan way. Compromise. That's what our founding fathers envisioned that we would do, working together so that we have a balanced approach. Let's look at compulsory spending, mandatory spending. We can organize our health care delivery system in a more cost-effective way, dealing with individuals with high-cost interventions. We can save money there, reduce hospital readmission rates. There's ways that we can bring down costs in a sensible way. Our troops are coming home from Afghanistan. We can reduce our military spending. And we can certainly look at the $1.2 trillion we spend every year through the tax code. That's on a yearly basis, tax expenditures. And we can certainly close some of those loopholes and get the badly needed revenues so that we can deal with our budget in a balanced, responsible way. Let's work together, bipartisan, Democrats and Republicans. One more thing it will do. Solving problems give predictability, and people will know what the rules are. They'll know what our budget is, they'll know what our tax code is, and that unleashes our economy and creates jobs, which helps this economy and helps balance our budget. So, Madam President, I just urge my colleagues, let's take the next step. The next step is let's go to conference on the budget. Let's work out the differences between the House and the Senate. Let's do what we were supposed to do in regular order. I urge my Republican colleagues to remove their objections, and let's get to a conference on the budget as soon as possible. With that, I see my distinguished friend from Utah that's on the floor, and I always learn a lot after he speaks, so I'm going to yield the floor to my colleague from Utah.
Madam President.
Senator from Utah.
I thank my dear friend and colleague from Maryland, and he really is a wonderful person and a very good senator. I enjoy him on the Senate Finance Committee. He's one of the brighter people on that committee and among a whole bunch of very bright people. Madam President, I rise today to speak on a matter that deserves the attention of everyone in this chamber. By now, we all know what's been going on at the Internal Revenue Service. We've seen the report from the Treasury Inspector General for Tax Administration, or TIGTA we call it, indicating that between 2010 and 2012, the IRS is targeting conservative groups applying for tax-exempt status for increased levels of scrutiny. We've read the account, or the accounts, I should say, of conservative groups that were asked improper questions about their donors, while some of their applications were delayed for more than 3 years, even as applications for groups friendly to the President and liberal causes were promptly approved. And we've heard the apologies from senior IRS officials and the condemnations from the White House itself. While we know for a certainty that this unacceptable behavior was going on at the IRS, there is still much more we don't know. For example, we still don't know why the targeting began or why only conservative groups were targeted by the IRS examiners. We don't know the full extent to which senior officials at the IRS and Department of Treasury became aware of these practices when they found out, and what they did or did not do to put a stop to these practices. And perhaps most importantly, we don't know why, when members of Congress asked questions about these issues last year, And after senior officials certainly knew of the problem or problems, we were led to believe that no groups were being targeted. Indeed, neither Congress nor the American people learned anything about these activities from the responsible officials until they were trapped and their hands were forced. Madam President, there really aren't words to describe what's going on here. Some of us have tried. Words like unconscionable, unbelievable, and Nixonian have been thrown around rightfully, in my opinion. But regardless of the words we use to describe it, this is easily the most shocking and outrageous turn of events we've seen in Washington in some time, and that's saying something. One thing I'm glad to see is that these actions have, for the most part, been condemned by members of both parties. In the end, I hope both Republicans and Democrats will work together to address these issues. I've said from the outset that it doesn't matter if a tax-exempt group is liberal, conservative, or moderate. It is an outrage that the IRS would single out any group based on its political beliefs. On that point, there is bipartisan agreement in Congress and throughout the country. On the Senate Finance Committee, Chairman Baucus and I are undertaking a bipartisan investigation into this matter to find out exactly what happened and make sure this type of thing never happens again. I'm happy to be working with Chairman Baucus on this effort, and I want to assure my colleagues that we're going to get to the bottom of this. We're going to find out just how far down the rabbit hole the IRS went in singling out groups based on their political beliefs. We're going to find out why the IRS ignored a bedrock rule of tax administration: treat similarly situated taxpayers similarly, always. We're going to find out exactly who was responsible, and we're going to hold them accountable for their actions. The IRS needs to come clean about what went on here. Chairman Baucus and I intend to make sure that they do. Sadly, while the targeting of conservative groups in the review process has gotten most of the attention thus far, there are other issues involving the IRS that are every bit as disconcerting. There are news reports indicating that in 2012, the same IRS office improperly disclosed confidential information about certain conservative groups to media organizations. Last November, the journalist group ProPublica requested 501c4 applications for 67 different nonprofits. Less than 2 weeks later, the IRS produced application documents submitted by 31 of the organizations. Included in this group of documents were the applications from 9 conservative organizations that were still under consideration by the IRS. ProPublica subsequently posted 6 of those applications in redacted form on the Internet and published articles analyzing the information they obtained. Now, this is disturbing for at least 3 reasons. First and foremost, under Section 6103 of the Internal Revenue Code, the IRS is prohibited from disclosing applications for tax-exempt status that are still under review. And while the IRS is authorized under Section 6104 to release application materials of groups that have already been granted tax-exempt status, pending applications are required by law to remain confidential. This appears to be a pretty cut-and-dried violation of the Internal Revenue Code, meaning that civil and criminal penalties may apply. Second, the IRS responded to ProPublica's request in just 13 days. That seems extraordinarily swift, and it raises the question of how long the IRS normally takes to respond to such document requests. I don't want to prejudge anything, but I suspect it usually takes longer than 13 days to hear back from the IRS. It certainly takes longer than that for the IRS to respond to requests from Congress. Finally, this revelation comes not too long after other allegations that the IRS disclosed confidential information submitted by conservative nonprofits. In the spring of 2012, activist groups and media outlets began posting confidential donor information regarding the National Organization for Marriage, a nonprofit 501c4 organization, on the Internet. Such information is also required by law to be kept confidential. Though the IRS is authorized to release yearly forms filed by tax-exempt organizations, the law prohibits donor information from being disclosed, and that's whether it's a conservative, moderate, or liberal organization. Yet the National Organization for Marriage's documents that found their way online in the middle of a presidential election appeared to have come from the IRS. This was suspicious, to say the least. That's why in May of 2012 I sent a letter to the IRS Commissioner requesting an investigation into whether the IRS publicly disclosed confidential donor information about the National Organization for Marriage. To date, I have not yet received a substantive response. So, Madam President, in addition to the revelations that the IRS was improperly targeting conservative groups for scrutiny of their 501c4 applications, we have these unanswered questions about the possible legal disclosure of confidential information to media outlets and other organizations. This is another matter that needs to be resolved in order to restore the credibility of the IRS as a government agency. That's why I, along with all the Republican members of the Senate Finance Committee, have submitted a letter to the Treasury Inspector General asking that he look into these issues. Among other things, our letter requests that TIGTA, that is the Inspector General's organization, investigate to determine which employees at the IRS were responsible for improperly disclosing confidential documents to ProPublica and whether any actions have been taken against them. In addition, this letter asks for an investigation to whether the IRS followed its usual Freedom of Information Act procedures in its prompt response to ProPublica's document request. And our letter asks TIGTA to determine whether the IRS ever undertook an investigation to determine if the agency was responsible for leaking the National Organization for Marriage's donor information. Madam President, the American people have a right to expect government agencies to perform their functions in a neutral, unbiased manner. When any agency breaks that trust, it undermines the credibility of the entire government. These aren't matters that can simply be washed away or wished away by public apologies and condemnations. They can't be covered up by a handful of resignations, and they aren't covered up by an apology. I hope the administration knows this. The only way to fully address these issues and to restore the credibility of the IRS is to have full accounting of the facts. And one way or another, we're going to learn all we can about the facts and what went on there. I hope that we can do so with the full and complete cooperation of the administration. Look, the IRS is the most powerful agency in government. Our liberties depend upon an impartial IRS. We know that many of the employees at IRS are represented by one of the toughest unions in this country. You can presume from that most of them are not Republicans. Be that as it may, the Democrats I know that I honor and respect are those who keep their word, live within constraints, follow the rules, do what's right, and fight hard for their principles. But the IRS is not a place where you should be doing anything but fighting hard for the principles of fair treatment of all U.S. citizens. I would be decrying this if the IRS was doing this to liberal organizations. We don't expect it to ever do that, but I would surely be decrying it. All I can say is that the very essence of liberty is involved with what the IRS does or is doing. If we can't rely on the most powerful agency in government to treat people fairly, and this country's in much greater trouble than many of us think it's in. And we know we're in trouble. We know that we're living beyond our means. We know that we're not doing what's right in this country. We know that Congress could do a much better job than it's doing, and that includes both Democrats and Republicans. But it's inexcusable for an agency with the power that the IRS has to be involved in these type of shenanigans. It's chilling, absolutely chilling to anybody who thinks about it, that this most powerful agency can basically come down on anybody for almost any reason if it's not honest. We have to restore the trust and the honesty of the IRS. And we've got to be able to rely on the IRS being fair, impartial, and in doing what's right. I think I can speak for my colleagues on the Democrat side. Many of them are as outraged as I am about what went on here. It just isn't right. And I think the American people fully understand that. Well, Madam President, I appreciate those who are honest. I appreciate those who do abide by their ethical constraints. I appreciate those who aren't political at the IRS. There are many good people working there, and I don't want them to be besmirched by the few. And there might be a little bit more than a few people who really don't honor the ethical constraints that the IRS simply has to live up to. Let's hope that neither side will ever again use the IRS for political purposes. Madam President, I yield the floor.
Madam President.
Senator from Florida.
Thank you, Madam President. Are we in morning business?
We are.
Okay. Madam President, I ask, unless there's objection, I ask for consent. I won't use the whole time, but that I may be recognized to speak for up to 15 minutes.
Without objection.
Thank you, Madam President. And I wanted to come to the floor today to follow up on the news that we've had on this IRS situation, which I know is concerning to all Americans, Democrats, Republicans, everyone. The power of government is real, and the power of the IRS is very real. And so anytime anything involves an abuse of power in the IRS, it's going to concern Americans irrespective of their political leanings. Before I do, I just want to comment on something that happened a few minutes ago in a press conference at the White House. And I have tremendous respect for the office of the presidency and for anyone who would hold themselves up to hold the office. And so I say this with the highest of respect. I think that the President today in his press conference potentially made a mistake in an answer that he gave, and I would encourage the White House to clear it up as soon as possible. He was asked specifically if he or anyone in the White House knew about what was going on at the IRS before April 22nd of this year, and the President's answer was that he didn't know about the Inspector General's report until he read about it in the press. So I would submit to you that he did not answer that question, and I'm not implying that he did know about it. I'm just encouraging the White House and those there to clear this up as soon as possible. It's kind of reminiscent of when Attorney General Holder would not answer Senator Paul's question about whether American citizens could be targeted in the homeland with a drone, and that led, we all remember, to what it led to. So it's just a very simple and straightforward question. I would encourage the White House and the President to echo what Jay Carney said just a couple of days ago, which is no one in the White House knew anything about it. And I think it's important for the President to answer that clearly. Again, not because I'm implying that he did know, but because I think if you leave that out there, it creates questions, and that shouldn't be created. And I hope that they will do that. It's important. I want to bring to the attention of the Senate and to the American people a compilation of stories that have emerged since the initial question emerged, and they're very, very troubling, and they extend, quite frankly, beyond the IRS. But I'll begin with the IRS. Here's a report from the Washington Examiner. The headline reads, "The IRS denied tax-exempt status to pro-lifers on behalf of Planned Parenthood." But let me read what it says inside. It says, "In one case, the IRS withheld approval of an application for tax-exempt status for Coalition for Life of Iowa. And in a phone call that this reporter reporting here had with one of the leaders, one of the leaders claims that in a phone call that he had with the IRS on June 6th of 2009, the IRS agent, Ms. Richards, told the group to send a letter to the IRS with the entire board's signature stating that under perjury of law they do not picket / protest or organize groups to picket or protest outside of Planned Parenthood. And they said that once the IRS received this letter, this application would be approved." That's troubling if true. So that's one report that's in the news. Here's another one. This one comes from a very respected individual in the United States. His name is Franklin Graham. He's the son of the Reverend Billy Graham. And he claims that the Billy Graham Evangelical Association and the Family's International Humanitarian Organization, Samaritan Purse, the IRS notified them in September that it was conducting a, quote, review of their activities for tax year 2010. He goes on to say, by the way, that this review happened after Mr. Graham's organization published newspaper ads in North Carolina backing a state constitutional amendment banning same-sex marriage. That's in the news. Here's another report. That was Politico. Again, I'm just reporting different outlets what they're reporting. This is another report that has been out there. This, I think I alluded to this yesterday in my speech. This talks about how the same IRS office that deliberately targeted conservative groups applying for tax-exempt status in the run-up to the 2012 election released 9 pending confidential applications of conservative groups to ProPublica in late last year. In fact, I think this is actually ProPublica admitting that that's where they got the information from. This was in response to a request for the applications of 67 different nonprofits last November. So this is an admission basically here from ProPublica, which is this not-for-profit investigative reporting group. They're admitting that the source of these leaked documents was the IRS office in Cincinnati, the leaked document of 9 conservative groups. So now it's no longer audits, it's cooperating with investigative journalists by providing them information which is illegal to provide them, confidential tax information. That's what this report says from the organization who got the leak. This is Fox News Latino. It reports that the former president of the San Antonio Tea Party said that they received a questionnaire with over 50 questions, including inquiries into whether the group met with, who the group met with, where their meetings were held, who was in attendance, the subject of internal emails, et cetera, et cetera. This, I think, is just in line with some of the other stories we've been hearing around the country. This was actually posted online, and these are letters going back and forth between the Richmond Tea Party and the IRS. This is the actual letters here that we pulled online with some information acted for privacy. And just some of the questions they were asked. Provide the following information for all events and programs you have conducted and participated from October 22nd to now. They wanted copies of handouts you provided to the audience. If there were any speeches or forums conducted in the event or program, provide detailed contents of the speeches or forums, the names of the speakers and panels, their credentials, the names of persons from your organization and the amount of time they spent on the event or the program. Indicate the percentage of time and resources you spent on all the programs in relation to your activity. It goes on and on. These are pages after pages after pages after pages of information being asked of a citizen group from the IRS. And anyone who's gotten a letter from the IRS understands it's never a pleasant thing unless there's a refund check in that envelope. You go in the mailbox, you open it, it says IRS, and everyone doesn't like that. Now just imagine this group of everyday citizens. These are not professional political activists. They don't have entire law firms at their disposal. These are just everyday Americans who are speaking out about the principle of limited government and free enterprise. And by the way, they were speaking out in favor of big government, or whatever. They'd still have the same right not to be harassed by the IRS. So I just want to bring the real face of this to bear, because this is not just a problem with an abuse of power in the IRS. Think about the application this has had on the lives of everyday Americans who one day decided, I want to get involved in politics, I want to speak out, I want to say something, and you get hit with a letter like this kind of questionnaire, which quite frankly what happens with a lot of these groups is they just decide, I'm not going to do it. I'm just not going to speak out, I'm not going to get involved, I don't have the time for this, and I don't need the hassle. Maybe that was the intent. So we went over that for a moment. Here's something that's really troubling. This is from USA Today. USA Today headlines, IRS approved liberal groups while Tea Party in limbo. Some of these groups were approved in as little as 9 months. Bus for Progress in New Jersey, a not-for-profit that uses red, white, and blue buses to drive the progressive change. Missourians organizing for reform and empowerment. They got their tax-exempt status just 9 months after a pretty simple and straightforward process. Progress Florida, in my own home state, similar experience. Again, this is the USA Today. I think this was their cover story yesterday, where it described the differences of how Tea Party groups are treated in comparison to groups that had things in their title like Progress or Progressive. Here's one more that actually shows that this kind of behavior extends beyond the Internal Revenue Service. This is from the Competitive Enterprise Institute, May 14th, and it talks about how public records produced by EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency, in response to a lawsuit filed by CEI under the Freedom of Information Act, shows a pattern of making it far more difficult for limited government groups, in particular those who argue for more freedom and less EPA, how it makes it harder for them to get access to public records. So, for example, green groups such as the Natural Resources Defense Council, the Sierra Club, the Public Employees for Environmental Responsibility, Earth Justice, they had their fees waived in 75 out of 82 cases. Meanwhile, the EPA effectively or expressly denied CEI's request for fee waivers in 14 of its 15 requests. 14 of its 15 requests. So that's 93% of the time versus basically the alternative here, which what they did with these other groups. Again, all a chain and a pattern of behavior that I think is really not anything any of us ever want to see. And so far I haven't seen it, and I don't think we're going to, quite frankly. I suspect you won't see a single member of Congress come to the floor of either chamber and say this is acceptable behavior. I want to tie in the loop, though, because this is not just about these agencies run amok. This is not just about a handful of people in the IRS, a Cincinnati office, or somewhere else doing something wrong. I mean, this is much deeper than that. And I've talked about it yesterday, I'll repeat it today, and that's a sense that this administration has pursued a real culture of intimidation in the political process, both through the way it ran its campaign. But I want to take it one step further. What this really should remind us of is the dangers of government power. Let me stop there and remind someone of everything. We need government. No one here, I don't know any anarchists that serve in the U.S. government for the most part. All of us believe that government has an important role to play in our country, the national defense. We, by and large, believe that there needs to be a safety net to help those who cannot help themselves, not as a way of life, but to help those who have fallen to stand up and try again. We think the government plays an important role in our laws. I mean, one of the things that attracts people to the U.S., for example, to do business here, is that we have a legal system where your property rights are going to be respected. So if you say you own a piece of property, it belongs to you. No one would necessarily dispute that. And if they do, you have to go to court. There are countries in the world where the owner of the property is whoever has the bigger guns or whoever has the best connection to government. And so we take that for granted sometimes, but in the United States, so there's a role for government to play, and it's a very important role. But the problem is that our framers, the founders of this nation, had a deep suspicion of government, no matter who was running the government. They rejected this notion that if you just put really good people in government, you'll have really good government. Government has a role to play, but when government powers extend beyond its natural limits or its important limits, you start to have problems like this emerge. And I bring this to the core because this is exactly what we've been debating here in so many instances, is expanding the natural power of government beyond where it should be and allowing it to have jurisdiction and influence over areas of our life where no matter who's in charge, Republican or Democrat, you may not like the way it turns out. We talked about the IRS for a moment. The IRS is going to be on the front lines of enforcing the health care law. So this is the same agency of government that has, for the most part, over the last few years, now by admission of everyone involved, been abusing the power, at least some of their employees have. I don't want to besmirch the entire agency. As Senator Hatch was saying a moment ago, there are very good people that work all throughout government who would never participate in this sort of behavior. But my point is, this is the agency that was targeting Americans because they were organizing themselves as conservatives. This is now the agency that's going to be empowered with new powers it's never had before. The power to force every American to either buy health insurance or pay a fine. Buy health insurance or pay a tax. And in the weeks to come, I'm going to be outlining examples of why giving government more power than it should have creates situations like this, the potential for situations like this to occur. There was enormous wisdom in limiting the power of the federal government that our framers had. Enormous wisdom in that. That's why they specifically said, if this Constitution doesn't give the federal government this power, it doesn't have it. And we sometimes forget that lesson 2 centuries later, but we shouldn't. That's an important limit. And I think we can have an honest debate about what role government should be playing in our lives and in our economies. There could be an honest debate about that, because there is a role for government to play. There is an important role for government to play in our country, but it can go too far, whether it's in the realm of civil liberties or economic liberties. And that's what I think the debate should really be focused on in the weeks to come, in addition to getting to the bottom of what's happened here, understanding clearly what's happened here. You know, I'm involved in another endeavor, immigration reform. One of the biggest impediments to immigration reform that I am facing, that we are facing, is this distrust of the federal government, the belief that they're not going to enforce the law. No matter what we pass or what we put in place, they're not going to do it. We tried this 20, 30 years ago, they didn't do it. And that's unfortunate. I hope we can overcome that. I believe we can. Because the truth is that the vast majority of Americans, vast majority of Republicans, Democrats, independents, are willing to deal with the fact that we have 11 million people living in this country illegally, so long as we can ensure that this problem never happens again in the future. They're willing to deal with that. And we have to win their confidence that, in fact, the measures that we're going to take are going to prevent that from happening in the future. But we're struggling because people have such a distrust of the government's willingness or ability to enforce the law. So you see it even in that issue rear its head. But I think it's important to remind ourselves that even if government is run by the best people with the best of intentions, it has a tendency to do these sorts of things. You see that at every level, but particularly at the federal level, where it has such enormous powers. And so anytime we come here and debate giving government a new power or a new agency or a new mandate or a new jurisdiction, we should be cognizant of the history of government power. We should be cognizant of what it's meant throughout human history. We should remember why the framers limited that power to begin with. It's because they understood that that power could be abused. And so I'll close by just saying that in the weeks to come, I know that I, along with all my colleagues here, just want to get to the bottom of this. We want to understand from the IRS's perspective who was involved in doing this, why did this happen, and more importantly, what can we do now to make sure that this never, ever happens again? What can we do now to ensure that not just in the IRS, but across the government, that a situation like this never happens again? So no matter what your political persuasion may be, no American ever feels afraid to speak out politically because they may wind up the target of governmental action. Mr. President, I yield the floor.
Mr. President,
Senator from Vermont.
I would ask unanimous consent to speak for 20 minutes.
Without objection.
Mr. President, I would ask unanimous consent to place into the record remarks made this morning, or the English translation of remarks made this morning by Pope Francis, who addressed the new non-resident ambassadors to the Holy See. And I don't usually comment much on religious matters, but I was very impressed by what the Pope had to say today. And in his remarks, Pope Francis called for a revamping of the global financial system, a system which he pointed out benefits the few, values money over human dignity, and continues to widen the gap between the rich and everybody else. While acknowledging the advances that modern society has made in healthcare, education, technology, and other areas, the Pope expressed his concern for the least amongst us. And this is what the Pope said, and I quote, "We must also acknowledge that the majority of the men and women of our time continue to live daily in situations of insecurity with dire consequences. Fear and desperation grip the hearts of many people, even in the so-called rich countries. The joy of life is diminishing, indecency and violence are on the rise, poverty is becoming more and more evident, people have to struggle to live and frequently to live in an undignified way," end of quote. And then the Pope went on to say in his rather brief remarks, he said that, quote, "One cause of this situation is in our relationship with money and our acceptance of its power over ourselves and our society. The worship of the golden calf of old has found a new and heartless image in the cult of money and the dictatorship of an economy which is faceless and lacking any truly humane goal," end of quote. And then the Pope continued, "The worldwide financial and economic crisis seems to highlight their distortions and, above all, the gravely deficient human perspective, which reduces man to one of his needs alone, namely consumption. Worse yet, human beings themselves are nowadays considered as consumer goods, which can be used and thrown away. We have begun a throwaway culture." And he said also, "Solidarity, which is the treasure of the poor, is often considered counterproductive, opposed to the logic of finance and the economy." And further, quoting the Pope, "While the income," and I hope everybody listens to this, "while the income of a minority is increasing exponentially, that of the majority is crumbling." Let me repeat that. That is what the Pope said just today. While the income of a minority is increasing exponentially, that of the majority is crumbling. This imbalance results from ideologies which uphold the absolute autonomy of markets and financial speculation, and thus deny the right of control to states, which are themselves charged with providing for the common good. A new, invisible, and at times virtual tyranny is established, one which unilaterally and irremediably imposes its own laws and rules. Moreover, indebtedness and credit distance countries from their real economy and citizens from their real buying power. Added to this, as if it were needed, is widespread corruption and selfish fiscal evasion, which have taken on worldwide dimensions. The will to power and of possession has become limitless. And this is from a speech that Pope Francis made today. Well, I think it's important that we listen to the Pope on this issue. Frankly, I have strong disagreements with the Catholic Church on issues of women's rights, issues of gay rights, and a number of other issues. But on this issue of what is happening economically around the world, the power of financial markets, the growing gap between the very rich and everyone else, the need for government, for states around the world to step in and protect the dispossessed, the need to understand that money unto itself means nothing unless it is being used in a way which improves the lives of all people. That is a message coming from the Pope which is worth thinking about and discussing. Now, here in the Senate, I hear a lot of criticisms of government, and some of which is certainly justified. And all of us, I would hope, are deeply concerned and embarrassed and disagree with what the IRS did in terms of picking out one political persuasion in terms of tax-exempt status. That's clearly wrong, unacceptable, must be dealt with. But many of my friends attack government day after day when government is trying to do the right thing in protecting middle-class and working families. There are some in the Congress, for example, who believe that government programs like Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid should be significantly cut, or that maybe government shouldn't even be involved in those areas, and they believe that these programs are unconstitutional. Well, if you were to eliminate Social Security and you eliminate Medicare and Medicaid, what happens to tens and tens of millions of people who rely on Social Security for their retirement, especially at a time when many private pensions have been cut severely? If you make cuts or eliminate Medicare for the old, or you undo the Medicare system that we know it and make it into the system that our friends in the House would like to have, what happens to elderly people when they get sick and need health care and don't have the money in their own pockets to pay for that? I will tell you what happens. This year alone, it is estimated that approximately 45,000 Americans will die because they never made it to a doctor on time when they should have made it. Well, if you make major cuts in Medicare, or do you do away with the basic guarantees that Medicare now provides, clearly the number of people who will die will simply increase. If you are 67 years of age and are diagnosed with cancer and Medicare is not there for you, and you don't have a family which has money, what happens to you? Well, some of my Republican friends will say, well, go to charity. Well, charity is not going to be there to provide health care for millions and millions of people. And in terms of health care, what we must point out over and over again because many Americans don't understand it. Our nation is the only nation in the industrialized world which does not guarantee health care to all people as a right of citizenship. And today, although we hope that will change in the very near future, 50 million people have no health insurance. Many others have large deductibles or co-payments which keep them from going to the doctor when they should. On Saturday in Vermont, we have invited the ambassador from Denmark to join us and do a town meeting. And he will explain to us how in Denmark, among many, many other countries throughout the world, they can provide health care to people which is virtually free from out-of-pocket expenses, and yet per capita end up spending substantially less than we do. He will explain to us why the cost of their prescription drugs is substantially lower than it is in the United States. In terms of education, at a time when in my state, the average college graduate in Vermont leaves school some $28,000 in debt, roughly the national average, at a time when hundreds of thousands of young people cannot afford to go to college, and we lose all of their intellectual capabilities and the genius that they might provide for our society, why it is that in Denmark college education is virtually free, including graduate school and medical school. At a time when in our country millions of people are overworked and underpaid, at a time when we work some of the longest hours of any people in the industrialized world, when people in Vermont are working not 40 hours a week but 50 hours a week, 60 hours a week, people are working not one job but two jobs, three jobs, trying to cobble together an income, at a time when some employers are hiring people and providing zero vacation time, or maybe, if you're lucky, a week off. How does it happen that in countries like Denmark, people not only get 5 weeks guaranteed paid vacation, but they get another 11 vacation days? In this country, we talk a lot about family values, but if you're a working-class woman having a baby, you'll get some maybe, if you're working for a large enough employer, the family medical leave may impact, and you may get some time off to have the baby, but you can't stay home very long to take care of your newborn because you're not getting any money coming in. And millions of folks have a baby, they got to go right back to work, put the child in child care when they would prefer otherwise. How does it happen that in countries like Denmark, women get 4 weeks off, fully paid before they give birth, and then months off afterward to stay home with the baby, not to mention 3/4 payment from the government for child care, which we do so poorly about. So, Mr. President, I think it's time that we have a serious discussion about values. And that discussion has got to include whether or not we feel good about the fact that in this country so few have so much and so many have so little. If we feel comfortable with the growing imbalance in terms of income and wealth such that the top 1% owns 38% of the wealth and the bottom 60% owns only 2.3%, and that gap between the billionaire class and everybody else is growing wider. And as the Pope indicated, are we comfortable with a financial system whose goal is not to invest in the productive economy, but to make money for itself, such that the top 6 financial institutions in this country have assets equivalent to some 70% of the GDP of the United States, some $9 trillion, an enormous political power. Are we comfortable? You know, this IRS business that people are talking about on the floor is related to the absurd campaign finance system that we have, by which big money can secretly put hundreds of millions of dollars into the political process. Are we comfortable about a political system when people can make contributions in secret that ends up in the political process and then ends up on 30-second ads on our TV? Money coming from billionaires who don't have to disclose their contributions. So when we talk about values, it is important to assess who we are as Americans and what we believe in. And I believe that most Americans believe that we have got to do a lot better job and focus on the needs of the declining or disappearing middle class, that we have got to create millions of jobs so that our young people do not have outrageously high levels of unemployment, that older people who lose their jobs have nothing to go back to, that we have got to address the issue of high childhood poverty, and that we have got to make sure that, in fact, government works for all of the people and not just the people on top. So, Mr. President, I would just conclude by recommending to the members and to the American people that they examine the remarks made this morning by Pope Francis, which I think raised some very, very important issues. I think there is a lot to be learned from those remarks. And with that, Mr. President, I would yield the floor and note the absence of a quorum.
The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Alexander.
Morning, everyone. Today, the House is voting to repeal the President's health care law because it's increasing the cost of health insurance, reducing access to care, and making it harder for small businesses to hire new workers. This is the third full repeal vote that we've had in the last 3 years. And some critics have suggested it's a waste of time. Well, while our goal is to repeal all of Obamacare, I would remind you that the President has signed into law 7 different bills that repealed or defunded parts of that law. Is it enough? No. A full repeal is needed to keep this law from doing more damage to our economy and raising health care costs. But some progress has been made, and Republicans will continue to work to scrap the law in its entirety so we can focus on patient-centered reforms that lower cost and protect jobs. Because jobs is what this is all about. These are the thousands and thousands of pages of Obamacare regulations. And if we want jobs, we need to get rid of this, because this is getting in the way of employers hiring workers around the country. And that's why we're continue to be focused on repeal, because we want to improve the economy and improve the prospects for creating jobs in our country. Listen, jobs is our primary focus, but while we're focused on that, we're also focused on holding this administration accountable. Our committees are working overtime to uncover the truth about what happened in Libya. and they're trying to get to the bottom of what happened in the IRS scandal. You know, public service requires humility, and everyone in public office needs to be constantly reminded that they serve the American people, and it's not the other way around. Americans should never be targeted or harassed by their government for their political beliefs. And if reporters' telephone calls are being monitored, the government better have a clear and convincing reason for doing so. And when American people or Americans are killed abroad, the government should tell the truth, not shade it or stonewall it for partisan purposes. Our system requires the bonds of trust between the American people and their government. And those bonds, once broken, are very hard to repair. Nothing dissolves the bonds between the people and their government like the arrogance of power here in Washington. And that's what the American people are seeing today from the Obama administration. Remarkable arrogance. This House will stop at nothing to get to the American people the answers and the accountability that they expect. But the best way to repair this damage is for the administration to come forward with the truth, the whole truth, so that the American people will have all of the facts.
Mr. Speaker, when you say that people should go to jail, are you talking about the frontline managers who came up with this inappropriate criteria, or are you talking about the top brass who didn't admit what happened to Congress?
I think I want to see the facts. I want to know how this happened, who was responsible for it. It's clear that there is law. Section 7214 of the Title 26 of the U.S. Code states very clearly, any officer or employee of the United States acting in connection with any revenue law of the United States who is guilty of extortion or willful oppression under the color of law shall be dismissed from office and, if convicted, be fined up to $10,000 and spend 5 years in jail. We need to know where the facts are. Somebody made a decision to do this, and I doubt that it were some low-level employees in the Cincinnati field office.
Mr. Speaker, Colonel O'Malley sent you a letter requesting that you support the legislation H.R. 940. Are you going to do what he has requested?
I have not seen this letter, and I'm not familiar with what H.R. 940 is.
Before the House passed the first repeal bill a few years ago, you promised both repeal and replacement legislation that more Americans would support. Are you still planning that? If so, when? And should we expect a series of small bills or something more comprehensive?
There was a discussion yesterday about that subject. And I expect our conference in the coming weeks to have a discussion about Obamacare and how we're going to deal with it and what the replacement legislation would look like.
Looking at this series of investigations, Benghazi, IRS, Associated Press, in 1998, you were here and you were relieved of your duties as the chair of the conference when the Republicans didn't pick up seats in the midterm election in 1998. Granted, there's an appropriate place for oversight in these areas, but is there a line where all of these different investigations crosses too far and there starts to be a potential backlash against your side, going into 14?
Well, that's why I continue to talk about jobs. It's our number one focus. But we have two jobs here. Our job is to legislate, and we're trying to legislate things that will help create jobs in our country. But we also have a...
50 years ago, in 1963...
We're in a quorum call.
I apologize, Mr. President. I ask for consent to dispense with the quorum call.
Without objection.
Thank you, Mr. President. 50 years ago, in August 1963, Martin Luther King wrote that injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. When a factory full of human beings collapses in Bangladesh, it matters in Bucyrus and Boardman and Bellefontaine. When the concrete ceiling of a shoe factory crumbles in Cambodia, it matters in Salina and Canton. Earlier this month, we observed Workers' Memorial Day. We pause, we remember those Americans who lost their lives on the job. We honor their memories. We've passed laws to help ensure that no other child waits by the door for a mother or a father who will never return home from work. Out of the ashes of the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire 100 years ago in New York City, we fought and won workplace safety reforms that helped save lives, countless lives, decade after decade after decade in our country. Even though we've passed the Occupational Safety and Health Administration Health Act of 1970, even though we have the National Labor Relations Board, we still have a moral responsibility to be vocal about violations to worker safety wherever it happens, whether it happens in Cleveland, whether it happens in Honolulu, whether it happens in Bangladesh. We're interconnected with this world. Our economy is linked to the women and children, to the people whose names we don't know, the workers we don't know, who sew labels we all know in our shirts and in our sweaters. American retailers, European retailers purchase some 2/3 of Bangladeshi garment production. That's why, Mr. President, in the aftermath of the deadly Rana Plaza collapse in Bangladesh, in the Wingstar Shoes collapse outside of Phnom Penh, we might have expected outraged American companies to take action. Not exactly what happened. Which member of this multi-billion-dollar industry will speak out for workers who face hazardous conditions for a minimum wage, in many cases of just $38 per month, making the clothes that we wear in this country? Today, Leader Reid, Senators Harkin of Iowa, Durbin of Illinois, Levin of Michigan, Leahy of Vermont, Murray of Washington State, and Rockefeller of West Virginia and I sent a letter to some of our leading American retailers. We're urging retailers like Walmart to sign on to a legally binding global accord to help ensure worker safety in Bangladesh. We're asking a list of American companies, we're asking a number of the largest retailers in America to sign on to this legally binding global accord to help ensure worker safety in Bangladesh. Remember, injustice, as Dr. King wrote some 50 years ago, injustice anywhere threatens our ability to create a more just world. Signing this accord from our retailers is one step that our leading retailers can take to help usher in a new era of justice in this new century. Thank you, Mr. President. I note the absence of a quorum.
Clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Alexander.